We declare the meeting open to the Okay, could I just again formally open the meeting to the public and welcome everyone here this morning to this committee of the Social Development Committee, and could I just do the normal housekeeping if members could be advised to switch off their electronic devices and so on. Obviously that would apply to anybody in the room also, please, with respect. Again, reminding members who are reviewing the tablets of the protocols around that. Could I ask any members with any interests relevant to the agenda today to declare that? If there are none to declare, then we can move on. Moving on to apologies, and we don't have any apologies. Do we have any apologies to record?
Sammy Wilson.
Sammy Wilson, thanks Paula for that. Okay, then moving on then to item number 2, the draft minutes. The draft minutes for the meeting on the 20th of February. That's on page 5 of your pack. And are members happy enough to agree the minutes as drafted for accuracy? I think that is members are content with that.
Great.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Moving then on to chairperson business, just a couple of items to draw attention to. Page 11 of your pack, you'll find the draft schedule. Sorry, where am I? Oh, matters arising. Sorry. Skip chairperson business, there are none. Matters arising, item number 4. Sorry, thank you, Kevin, for that. Just a couple of items again. Just in page 11 of your pack, you'll see the draft schedule of witnesses on phase 1 of the inquiry, and that's been prepared by our staff here. Members all be invited, the officials, to bring us a schedule here for this week to sign off on. You'll see there that the intention would be to schedule the witnesses for the 13th of March. Members are content then with that schedule, then we can agree that, and then we just do the Paula.
Sorry, just on page 11 of our pack, the part down at the bottom, to do with Stephen Brimstone, in the final paragraph at the bottom it said the special advisor has decreed that the meeting with William McCraig goes ahead. Is that what was decreed? Is that the word that was used, or what was that?
Yeah, Chair, that was the word that was actually used in the communications.
Okay, that's fine. Just want to check that. That's grand.
Okay. Okay, so members then content with it. We can move on that. Again, then also just to advise that a letter for them will be issued separately, as we had previously agreed to Mr. Turkington to request a written clarification in respect of the meeting on the 25th of January 2012. There's a letter again just from the department then providing further information in respect to phase 1 of the inquiry, and in particular the meeting of the 28th of June. And there's some information around that which we've received in terms of email exchanges and so on. So members content then to note that the information you have there.
Great.
The members content then we move on. Thank you for that. Next item on that matters arising on page 17 of your pack. The minister wrote to the committee through myself, just formally advising of his intention to take a small number of amendments to consideration stage of the Pavement Cafes bill. That's scheduled for the 4th of March. That's next Tuesday, I think. Now, most of these amendments have been tabled in response to concerns raised by this committee at the committee stage, so the committee very much welcomed that. We've discussed that with the department already. So that's up in the Assembly on Tuesday next, and obviously I speak for the committee. If anybody has any other comments they want to make on the amendments, then obviously it'll be open opportunity for everybody to make their comments on it, but I've tried to do the best to reflect the committee's views and concerns which had been raised in a response to the amendments tabled. Is that fair enough? Again then, just to remind people that we did write, as we agreed last week, to the BBC regarding provision of documents relating to the committee inquiry. The BBC has advised that they're currently reviewing their material and hope to provide the committee with their substantive response by early next week. Okay. Okay, members, so again, another item on page 150 of your pack. The Department has issued a press release announcing that the consultation on the Antisocial Behaviour Bill has been extended until 24th of March. You remember that the committee had asked the Department if they would actually extend the consultation period. We didn't get any notification of that, but it has been extended, and people will be, I think, grateful for that. So members had agreed that we wanted to issue a press release to encourage people to participate in that consultation. So members content that we do that. Okay, so there's a draft press release there, and it's additional to your tabled items there in front of you. Members are happy enough. I mean, if you want to come back to the content of that at the end of the meeting, then we'll probably do that. But I mean, it's just to let you know that matter, that a press release rather would be issued. Okay, so happy enough if people want to return that, or just in case they want a few minutes to read it during the meeting. Or
Chairman, sorry, just what's coming in there is the BBC issue was raised. They say hope to reply substantively by early next week. I would take early next week to be Monday or Tuesday.
I agree with you.
Right? So if we don't get anything by Thursday, we take immediate precipitative action. Having been messed about for more than a month now by the people who've caused us to be here, as I keep on saying. So do I take it that the committee would be in agreement that should be the case?
I mean, if members content that, I mean, I think that would be the general view of the committee. I mean, we've been asking the BBC on this for some time. Okay, so we'll deal with that next week, and likely on that basis. Okay, thank you for that. Then we can move then on to the substantive item on the agenda, as obviously all the others have been. This will be longer. So this is item number 5 on your agenda, which is the social housing reform. It's a departmental briefing, as you're aware. You also refer to table in page 7. The officials, Andrew Hamilton, Jim Wilkinson and Madeleine Nelson, here this morning. Can I formally welcome you this morning? You're very welcome indeed. And just want to say that obviously we very much appreciate the work that has already gone into this. It's a complex issue. It has required and will require quite considerable consideration and analysis and evidence gathering and consultations and so on. So can I first of all thank yourselves for making sure the work is being done on this. The other side of that coin, of course, is that you have a substantive piece of work presenting to us this morning. So it will take some time for people to absorb that, and I think they'll understand that. So obviously we're very, very happy and keen to take your presentation this morning. And obviously the members then will raise any issues or tease out any things that they have of concern or things that they want to, their own observations they'll make. So on that basis, then obviously then we're more content then to have your presentation. You're happy enough?
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you indeed for the opportunity this morning to share with you the results of our research and engagement on the various issues associated with the social housing reform programme. We have presented a lot of information to you in preparation for this session, but I should say at the outset, as you have just done, that we do not expect you to have absorbed all the detail of that. I see this very much as an initial engagement with you, and subject to your views, we'd be keen to come back and meet with you regularly over the next few months so that we can explore in more detail the various components of the programme. So this morning is essentially an update on our findings from our research and engagement, really in line with our mandate, our findings to date, and a setting out of the further work that we feel is necessary before detailed proposals are put forward. There are, as you can see, a number of different aspects to the programme, and what I would intend to do is to provide a strategic overview of where we are in each of those, and then we'll be very happy to take questions. So I suppose I should start with why are we doing this, and I think it's up front to say what we're doing this for is to see to what extent we can change the system so that it better meets the future needs of tenants and better maintains the stock, the existing stock that we have got. So it's very much a tenant focus. We face a number of challenges in the future, not least a financial one. But also at an operational level, there's a challenge of maintaining the existing stock. And as we'll see, there's I think a significant issue there, which is bubbling up in the future, which we need to begin addressing now. But I'll start first with the regional housing function. And as structured at the moment, the housing executive is essentially two businesses. On the one hand, it's a landlord, which manages and lets some 88,000 properties across Northern Ireland, and in that respect, probably one of the largest landlords in the UK. And indeed, for many stakeholders, that's what defines the housing executive. And the landlord function is seen very much as the primary focus of the housing executive. But the executive is responsible for a number of other functions, all of which are very important. And those functions lie well beyond the remit of a landlord. For example, the assessment of need, the administration of the housing selection scheme and common waiting list, the commissioning of the social housing development programme, the Supporting People scheme, and other initiatives which are designed to support privately owned properties, such as the Warm Home scheme and the boiler replacement programmes. So the two roles are quite distinct, and to some extent the sheer scale of the landlord function drowns out the regional function, and that those activities may not be pursued as optimally as they could be. I suppose this is not an issue which is unique to Northern Ireland. It's something that has been addressed elsewhere. There's a trend over the last 10 years or so where, irrespective of who is the landlord, there's been a separation of the landlord function and the regional housing authority function. And I suppose that's common with other trends in the public sector where the commissioning and planning function, such as in health, is separated out from the delivery function, which is delivered by trusts. And I think our key stakeholders here, the housing executive, the Federation of Housing Associations, have recognised the potential benefits of separating those functions. And we really want, as the next stage, to explore the merits of establishing a regional body to, in effect, to assume the regional function. And the potential here is really to look at whether a new body, a regional housing body, could have a much wider impact in terms of leading, on a regional basis, housing regeneration. And just making that housing market work much more effectively to meet the needs of our population. So in terms of the detailed work, we want to assess to what extent we can do this within the existing structures, the soft split. That's administratively already being pursued by the housing executive. The ONS classification of the housing executive has asked us to treat landlord function separately from the regional function. But we want to see whether we can do anything more within the existing structures. And then the second aspect of it, which is potentially much more ambitious, is to assess the implications of establishing a separate, self-standing regional housing authority as a non-departmental public body. And that in turn would mean a hard split from its landlord function, with the latter established as a separate public corporation to manage the public housing stock. So that's where we've got with that. There are some benchmarks and examples that we can consider. We've got the Homes and Communities. The Homes and Communities Agency in England as a role that's akin to what I'm talking about. But even at a more local level, local authorities themselves in Britain have really taken on this local regional role with their, and where they've retained public housing, they've put that into a body, an arm's length management body. So that separation, it's in the ether. We want to explore it in more detail. So then turning to the landlord function, whilst we feel that there's support from stakeholders for the separation of the landlord and the regional function, the status or structures that might deliver the landlord function is perhaps the most contentious issue under consideration. The jury is very much out on the degree to which that should remain in the public sector, or whether there should be significant transfers to the not-for-government sector. The facts of the matter is that the provision of social housing in Northern Ireland is currently delivered through a mixed economy, with 30% of all social housing administered by and managed by the Housing Association non-government sector. And that share is increasing as housing associations are now the sole delivery agents of new social housing. So over time, the trend has been an increasing proportion of social housing in Northern Ireland being delivered by the Housing Association. But it's not only about building new homes. Landlords do have a responsibility for maintaining the existing stock. And as the public capital in recent years that has been available has been devoted to new build, what our research has demonstrated is an increasing build-up of a significant capital investment requirement in the existing public housing stock. We've done a desktop update of 2009 condition survey, which, if you recall, had indicated that there was a requirement of something like 5.1 billion over the next 30 years. We've done a desktop update of that, and the level of investment that we feel that is now needed is somewhere between 6.1 and 6.6 billion. Now, these are initial estimates, and they will require much more detailed analysis. But the income likely to be available to the housing executive in its current form it will not be really sufficient to address this. And again, our estimate, heavily qualified at the moment, is that there could be a gap of as much as £750 million. So it's not, I wouldn't say a burning platform, but maybe it's beginning to be a smouldering one. And that's one of the reasons why we need to look at this in some detail. Now, we know that a large-scale stock transfer to the non-government sector, with its ability to borrow and to finance the necessary investment, that investment wouldn't be charged to the public account, but it would complement the public funding available. That could address this, but our assessment at the moment is that there's probably, and if you forgive me, neither the political consensus nor, importantly, a consensus among tenants and stakeholders to support a total stock transfer. And indeed, there is a strong element of support for the retention of public housing. And we know when we look at Britain that, yes, there are some local authority areas which have transferred all their stock to housing association movement. There is none of the jurisdictions have 100% of its public housing or social housing in the public sector. So what we want really to do now is to carry out a detailed analysis of really what can be achieved through, and what would be the implications of a public corporation retaining ownership of the existing stock, with new build continuing to be delivered with the housing associations. So that's essentially a public housing model with some incremental change at the margins. And then secondly, what we want to do is look at the implications of a significant stock transfer. And we might want to do more than one option here, to the non-government sector, either through the creation of one or more new housing associations or similar bodies, or to existing associations. And I think that would allow the issues and concerns to be tested and explored. A partial, albeit significant, transfer would continue the mixed economy approach to social housing, and paradoxically it actually may help support the retention of a significant proportion of social housing in public ownership, if that is the will of the Assembly. One thing that we would say up front is, if we were to proceed with stock transfers of this scale, that as for elsewhere, it would be subject to detailed consultation and ultimately a tenant vote. So that's where we are in the landlord function. Now, a new system such as that would require some change, we think, in how rents are controlled, how the system is regulated, how engagement with tenants and local representatives is taken forward. And I will go on now to address those issues, unless the committee wants to pause. And,
I think we're happy enough if you were just to continue on, Andy, with the presentation, then we come back, just because a lot of these things are obviously
they are
some way or other,
yeah, okay.
I'm happy enough for that.
Well, then, on the issue of rent, if I can come to that next. Well, first and foremost, rents must remain affordable to tenants, and whatever happens, we will make sure that that's the case. But we also have to be aware that rents need to be sufficient to maintain the properties in the longer term, in order really to be in a position to pass on quality stock to the next generation. And it has to be sustainable for landlords and their funders as well. Now, in Northern Ireland, the rent control arrangements that we have in place apply only to the public sector. It applies only to the stock, to the rents that are charged by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. And our research has shown that arrangements elsewhere will still allowing landlords to continue to set individual rents are much more comprehensive and impact across the social housing sector. So, again, our research, and we've put some figures in the papers which we're happy to go through with you. This seems in GB to have led to much smaller differences in rents between the public and non-public sectors. And indeed, where there's been much more convergence over time. And indeed, when we look at the Northern Ireland rents, we need to qualify this because it includes the cost of services. The Northern Ireland Housing Association rents tend to be at the upper end of the scale. Whereas the public sector, the housing executive rents are the lowest. Now, neither of those potentially issues are sustainable in the longer term. On the one hand, we need to make sure that rents are affordable or people will be squeezed out, and on the other, we need to ensure that the rents are sufficient to maintain the stock. So what we want to do now then is to take forward some detailed work to develop and consult on a rent policy for all social housing, which will provide for rents which are affordable and sustainable, and for a system which is simple and transparent and supports investment. So that would involve consultation and development proposals. Then regulation and inspection. This regulation inspection is a key component of any social housing system. Not only does it protect tenants and safeguards the taxpayer interest, but it also provides assurances to both landlords and their funders about the quality of their provision and the governance of their organisations. So the issue that really associated with regulation and inspection has not been so much about why are you doing this and whether you should do it. I think all stakeholders acknowledge its importance, but the issues are about how it should be done and who should do it. Currently, the role is carried out by the department. We adopt a very comprehensive approach, and indeed we would believe that that approach has been necessary. But some would argue that there's too much emphasis on process and compliance and that a more risk-based approach would be appropriate. And these are matters which have been formally considered elsewhere. And I'm conscious that we haven't done, or carried out a comprehensive review of our regulation and inspection process, and this has been done in other jurisdictions. There are issues about who should do it. Should it be done in by the department? I think it must be independent of the providers. But others would argue, or some would argue, that it could be also made more independent of government. And one of the issues that we want to explore, and this is where these issues are all interdependent, is if we were to go down the road of establishing a self-standing regional housing authority, should the regulation and inspection function sit with that organisation rather than with the department? So again, then, what do we want to do? Well, we intend to take forward some detailed considerations of the regulation and inspection process. Firstly, we want to bring forward consultation proposals on the regulatory approach, including the powers of the regulator. And then we also want to consider in more detail whether, there is scope for transferring the function to the Regional Housing Authority, or whether it should in fact remain within the department. The other issues then, key issues really, are about engagement. The existing engagement in housing matters are at 3 specific levels. We have at local level, where local councillors represent their constituents as landlords. We have district council level, where, for example, the Belfast City Council Housing Forum and district planning and the district planning consultation with all 26 councils by the Housing Executive. And then at the regional level, we have the Northern Ireland Housing Council. If anything, we would say that the changes now form of local government, with the transfer of responsibility for community planning and the planning function of the government, actually increases the need to have better engagement with local government. And we know and are aware, and have had discussions with the Housing Association Federation about the need to improve their engagement with local government. What we want to do really is to take forward detailed consideration of the systems for local government engagement. This would include a review of the Housing Association Guide and the requirements on housing associations to engage with local representatives and councils, a review of the potential models for council engagement on housing matters with a focus on housing executives regional levels, and a review of the regional engagement arrangements taking account of the reform of local government and the, if you like, the interface with community planning. So that's where we are with local government. I think until any new details are agreed or legislated for, the Northern Ireland Housing Council should continue to exercise its current statutory role, taking account of the new council structures. Then the other very important part of engagement is that with tenants. And our research reveals that the focus on tenant engagement and the empowering of tenants is very strong in the rest of the United Kingdom. Government departments are leading policy development in England, Scotland and Wales, and we're conscious that we, at this moment in time, do not have a tenant strategy for Northern Ireland. While there are strong examples within the Housing Executive and housing associations of tenant-focused services and engagement mechanisms, similar to that evidenced in other parts of the United Kingdom, I think it would be fair to say that there is a lack of consistency across the sector. Stakeholder feedback demonstrates a willingness from tenants and tenant groups to expand and improve on the current processes. So what we would like to do now is to begin work on developing a new tenant participation strategy, to review the regulatory framework and the Housing Association Guide so that social landlords also develop tenant strategies which will be subject to regulation and inspection processes, and explore at the regional level how tenant services can be supported, potentially through the Housing Communities Network and Supporting Communities Northern Ireland mechanisms across all social housing landlords. So that's the, in a nutshell, if I could call it that, what we're suggesting. The one issue that I haven't mentioned is the impact of all of this on the department. And clearly we would have to look at the roles of the department. If we set up particularly a regional housing authority, there may well be some transfer of responsibility from the department to the authority, but at the same time the department, through the Minister, will retain responsibility for strategy and policy and setting strategic direction for social housing as a whole. So there we are. I hope that was helpful for you. But I would emphasise the fact that we know this is complex. There's lots of detail here. With the best will in the world, we can't explore it in one session, so we're very, very happy to come back and have single focus issues, whatever way you would like to play this. And the Minister has asked me to say too that he would be very happy to come back and talk through the issues with you.
Thanks, Andrew, for that. I mean, it was well done for putting such a substantive presentation in a nutshell, as you described it. I need a big nut for that. But no, thank you for that. And before I bring members in, there's just a couple of wee queries I'd have before I bring members in. I think part of that, if you look at your paragraph 39 in terms of the end of your analysis, and then in terms of the next steps, I mean, that reads almost if there's, the kind of next steps is really predicated on the basis that we agree there'll be a split and there'll be, the separate functions and so on. So I'm not so sure that leaves us open. Certainly from my point of view, and I think others would have raised the same issue, that there needs to be wider analysis around what other alternatives it might be. And I think you do refer to in 44 around, like for example, the Housing Executive in its current form within the same legislation. So I just want to re-emphasise, because it has been raised on a number of occasions, the need to make sure we're not closing down options even by default when we move into the next steps.
Yeah, can I just respond, Chair, on that? Look, I'm very sensitive to that. We're not closing. We've tried to keep this open and to demonstrate that everything's open and nothing will be closed down until the end of the process.
You referred earlier on, Andrew, just to the soft split and the hard split. Some people would imagine, I would have to say as Chair, I'm concerned myself around the soft split. What does that actually mean? It may not be for yourself to give a specific answer on that, because it's really probably down to Housing Executive. Maybe the department, I'm not quite sure, but certainly there's been no mandate to split anything, so I think there will be a concern whether it's soft split or hard split, do you end up in the same place, even again by default, or in a place that people didn't agree. In other words, when you come to work this all out and tease it all out in a way in which you're saying with quite a comprehensive basis, do you end up with a fait accompli with the operation of a soft split, whatever that actually might be? So you may want to elaborate on that.
Chair, if I can maybe answer that. Really, I mean, what the paper says is the Housing Executive currently delivers an awful lot of regional housing functions and also carries out an awful lot of landlord functions. Traditionally, the Housing Executive in its business plan say, we're going to do X number, we're going to build X number of new homes, we're going to deliver X number of warm home schemes, we're going to do Y number of planned maintenance work, X number of response maintenance work for our tenants, and so many change of tenancies. What it really means is, what the Housing Executive are doing is saying, well, it's easier for us to concentrate and set targets for what we want to do as a regional body, and then targets for what we're going to do as a landlord, and report and focus on those individually, so that the board, rather than getting everything, will look at both. So that's really what a very soft split is. It's no change of functions, no change of responsibility. It's how you organise and look at your work. So it's just about sort of it's like a reorganisation, how you look at your work, rather than determining any new structures any new responsibilities, any new governance arrangements or any new reporting. Whereas maybe the hard split that's referred to would be saying in legislation, do you create 2 NDPBs?
Yeah.
One with a governing body who only is responsible for this,
Yeah.
and another with a governing body that's responsible for being a landlord.
Okay, Jim, thanks for that, Andrew. I have a number of members, Fra, Trevor, Dolores and then Michael.
First of all, I'd like to say thanks for the presentation. I think, as Alex said, there's quite a lot of information contained in it, and we've only got most of the papers of this past couple of days, so it's been difficult to concentrate and take in all the stuff. Although, I have to say, in the main document, there's quite a lot of stuff that's been out there in the ether already. And it's just I take it from what you're saying that there's been no decisions made at all about the future structures of housing. I think it's also fair to say that the executive had advised the minister that he should go away and look at options for the future of housing. But what I read here is really only one option coming out at the end, and that's the break of the housing executive between regional and landlord. And the strong possibility that it be divided into either one or more housing associations. When you were looking, did you look at the housing executive as it stands? With obviously there's some difficulties restructured within to deliver both regional and landlord functions.
Yeah, that would be one of the options.
That's
I
option
don't see
one.
any of that in there at all.
See, on 44, that's really that. 44 is saying what can you do with an existing legislative organisation arrangement.
See, that's the point. You've went at length in the paper to describe all the other things, but you get one part looking at within. See, obviously this all started with Pricewaterhouse a number of years ago, and I think it was Ali Catway actually brought in the Pricewaterhouse report, or got them and sent it to the thing. And that even they had said in their documents that there is a number of options there that people could look at. And I don't think this is even, see, one of the concerns that I have, and I know you're talking between soft and hard options. As a matter of fact, what concerns me, I was going to ask, who is Honey?
Sorry, who?
Honey, it's in the Housing Executive document. It seems to be a new organisation that the Housing Executive have either set up or are about to set up to deliver regional services.
That was their submission. That was housing service.
Part of our submission. Because even in the soft break, my understanding is also that they're at a fairly advanced stage internally of making the break between regional and landlord services. Now, I have to say that as an elected politician, I didn't agree to that. I understand that the executive hasn't agreed to it, and how can an organisation like the Housing Executive, which is an arm's length government body, go ahead and implement this? Actually quoting the minister and quoting the department on a direction that it should be going in terms of the breakup of the Housing Executive.
So I would just like anything the housing executive are doing at the moment, and I understand Chief Executive of the Housing Executive wrote to me recently saying I think he's going to write to the committee, he wants to come and give you some information about their reform programme. Everything they do is within their statutory remit. There still is the housing executive. How they organise their delivery while still being responsible for both is within the legislation. So there's no changes to legislation or statutory responsibilities or governance arrangements.
But see, there's the point. Tell me, so what you're saying is that they can go ahead and do all this here, and that the executive has no say in the direction that they're going?
No, what I'm saying is that the Housing Executive Board is responsible for the delivery of the housing executive functions, and it organises its delivery options. And I think maybe it is getting confused between this paper, which is talking about future structures, and current delivery proposals. And I think it probably will be useful, and I know the Housing Executive is very keen to talk to the committee about their programme.
Well, Chair, I understand what you're saying, and it goes back to the soft option or the hard option. But what I'm saying that as we speak at present, that whether it's the Housing Executive internally dealing with things, that we're being offered a fait accompli by the Housing Executive, that they're at the advanced stage of breaking into the regional and the landlord function. Now, that was to be part of the process that Andrew described there. So what we're doing is that we're being asked to decide the future of housing structures and that has a number of options, and some of it may be the Housing Executive to remain as it is, restructured internally to deal with both the regional and the landlord functions. But that has been taken away from us by the work within the housing executive at the present time, and that is what you call the soft option, the break of a regional organisation into a landlord organisation.
I'd have to say, I don't necessarily agree with that analysis. The housing executive
That's true.
the housing executive is currently the housing executive with its responsibilities, and it's currently organised itself to deliver those responsibilities.
That's the point that I'm making. Is it outside the control of the executive?
Yeah, what the reason I think, and again, the housing executive themselves will be happy to explore this with you in far more detail. But what, you know, our history here, even recent history since I've come into DSD, is that the landlord function hasn't been operating optimally, if I put it that way. And so they're looking at arrangements to give a much better focus on that, and their conclusion is they can do that better by making someone responsible ultimately within the organisation for the delivery of the landlord function, with no responsibility for other regional activities. And that's what they're trying to do. But Fran, just to reassure you in all of this, the option of a publicly managed social housing system, as we've got at the moment, is running. What I want to explore is whether that can be viable. Can that option deliver good quality homes and sufficient homes for the population? And if it can, then we will say it. I have no ideological commitment to a privatised approach or anything. The analysis will speak for itself, and at the end of the day, I suspect, when we do our work, more than one model will work. You know, this is not an either-or. We haven't done the work. We want to do the work and show you the impact, and then you can take a view, because we recognise ultimately the responsibility for the decision rests with yourselves and ministers.
Charles, just one point, and I want to go back. See, all the points that I'm making is that we have been given the paper this morning that lists out in detail the possibility of what can happen in terms of the future structure of housing and housing. Point that I'm making, and it keeps getting, and even 3 months ago when I asked this question, it got through back to the housing executive. You know, that we're near enough dealing with a fait accompli, because the housing executive will have went and certain people within the housing executive will have directed the housing executive in such a way that all of this will be a fait accompli, and that it will be done. It'll be difficult to pull it back, because one of the things that hasn't been really decided here is a housing executive Mark II. It hasn't been everything that. See, when you read the report, it sings the praises of the housing executive to the high dome. Everything from the regional structure, the way their district offices are laid out, the professionalism of their staff, their delivery within a community. And to me, I said to myself, that's brilliant. And then it goes on, and what there has always been, but it needs to change. You know, if it's so good at delivering those services, why would you want to change it? What you deal with is the problems that exist within it rather than dealing with it. And I have to say, under the leadership of Donald Hoodless, that it's been taken off in a different direction. That the housing executive has been purposely dismantled as we speak at the present time.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, you're getting a response, putting yourself in now, Trevor, you are getting a response from the Department officials. In a way, there's two issues, but again, they're very clearly linked to that. I mean, I think we're understanding of that, because there are the next steps, the suggestions, the proposals which we're looking and we're trying to assure they're open-ended in terms of options, and then the evidence will produce whatever that produces, and consideration will be based on all of that. The concern that you're raising, Fran, some of which I clearly share, and others have also identified it. I suppose we have to look at, we need to talk to housing executive in particular around the evolution of what might be described as, I think, Jim, you said, the soft split. So I suppose that for us, the implications of the evolution of that, where is that taking you to? People have a concern that it's a fait accompli. So, I mean, the issue's been raised, and obviously we'll be returning to that.
And maybe the easy way is that There is no legislative change to the status of the Housing Act. It's a single body with single responsibilities.
I appreciate that. That's simple. I mean, you've heard the concerns and raised, so Trevor.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. That's probably a good time to come in. There's a personal view. I mean, in terms of even what Fra has said, I think in terms of the report he talks about the housing side, they must have wrote it themselves, because when you look at this today, and I mean, I thank Andrew and the team for the amount of work's went into this. One of the things that strikes me, and I'm relatively new to this, but I was always reasonably good at maths. If you take the fact that you're in £6.1 billion of debt, in terms of trying to get to the situation where your housing stock isn't good and fit for purpose in terms of the tenants, it says to me that the previous ministers and the department has taken their eye off the ball in terms of the tenants, and it never was tenant focused. Because even in a quick mathematical thing, and I hadn't enough buttons in my calculator, even at £50,000 per property, if you sold everything today, you'd only bring in 4.4 billion. So what's actually been happening in terms of the housing side in the past, they must have written the report themselves, because they've been run about headless. And in terms of the leadership in the past, it's always lived headless as well. Because how you can be in a situation, I mean, maybe Andrew could explain how an organisation such as the Housing Society, if ever got to a situation where they could leave their stock in such a dire straits that it cost £6.1 billion to bring it up to a good standard.
If I agree with that, and then some of the
Members, now please, let's deal with this professionally.
I was talking more about the ones who want to give us the money to build houses. You know, I was talking more like your colleagues, actually.
Okay,
I know what you're talking about, Trevor.
all right,
Like
members.
to muddy the waters all
Okay,
the
members,
time.
now, sorry, look,
You wouldn't muddy the waters, no.
folks, please, let's one at a time have the concerns express the views, whatever they are, and then let the officials have the opportunity to respond.
I'll give you sort of a bird's eye view response to that. The 6.1 billion represents expenditure projections of ongoing maintenance and need for significant structural maintenance to deliver a fairly minimum standard, and it goes up to the 6.6 billion if we want to increase the standard to a more acceptable level. And when we do the sums of what's available, you know, generally through the public purse over the 30 years, we come out with this gap of around 750 million. Now, one of the issues, and which has really emerged from, is the impact in the last 5 or 6 years of the downturn in the market. Prior to that, the housing executive would have been selling, tenants would have been volunteering to purchase their houses under the right to buy scheme, and that was generating around 100 million a year, which was being reinvested in the stock. But since, you know, keep me right in the figures, but since then that virtually has dried up. And the public purse, and you know, and through rent and that, have been offset that a bit. But there's still a significantly lower level of investment being made now than was. The capital that was available to the department, and reflecting the priorities that were given to dealing with waiting lists and that, was devoted virtually entirely to new build. So I suppose it was, if I think back on my experience when times were hard in the health service, you know, what you tended to, this was wrong, I'd say, what you tended to do was not put enough into backlog maintenance. You know, stuff will be left for another year, and opportunistically the investment would have been made. Now, what we know, and this is the value of the exercise, what we know is that that is not sustainable. We need to make this investment, this significant capital investment, and the decision before us ultimately will be the degree to which that falls on the public purse, that has an opportunity cost for other public services, or the extent to which ultimately more private finance is, you know, levered into the system. That's ultimately the issue.
Just add to that, Andrew, because I think the issue is the 6.1 is, as Andrew said, literally the amount of investment that's needed in the stock. Projecting that over the 30 years, we get the gap because the housing executive is constrained by the income that it gets, and the income's made up from rents, the amount that it collects, but also the amount of subsidy it gets. And I think, as Andrew's last point around the capital, if you look at the capital investment that's gone into the stock over the last 10 years, I think in 2004-05 it was 103 million. In 12-13 that had reduced to 8 million. And there are obviously issues at the moment around ability to spend because of some of the contractual issues, but actually in terms of capital investment, that has gone down significantly over the last 10 years. And that's kind of that's helped build up what Andrew's talked about, some of the backlog in the maintenance that will be in that 6.1 billion. So over the last 5 years, there's maintenance planned and responsive that the housing executive's not done. So from today, we're already starting with a backlog of maintenance that's built up. And if you carry on doing that, that backlog will just carry on building up and build up.
But in terms of the capital money was coming from sales. So in a sense, it's still selling the family silver to fund something else that's actually getting worse. I mean, if you take the 88,000, I think it was 88,000 properties you said.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take the staffing levels within the housing sales today versus whenever they're sitting with their highest stock, I presume there's not much difference. So we've still the same number of people managing less homes. So I mean, it's not been run.
I haven't looked at that, but we actually have looked at
24 and 27 per
the
unit.
management costs of the landlord function, and they would, if anything, be a bit low. But
Well, I think you have to look at all the costs because, I mean, the total housing executive function is relevant to the 88,000 homes, regardless of what different parts of the organisation they're involved in. I mean, at the end of the day, if it was a private organisation, I would suggest there wouldn't be nearly as many people employed in it for the number of homes that they're trying to maintain.
But that's partly why you need to do even the soft split in terms of budgeting, because you need to know what the regional function costs and those regional services and what the landlord costs are.
But I think even where we're at today, and I mean, I would obviously be supportive of some form of split to try and make it a more profitable organisation, and more importantly, that the tenants' experience and the focus for the tenants is actually better than the experience they've had. Because I think even, and I'm paraphrasing what Andrew's words were, I don't think you said it brought them up to a particularly good standard. I can't remember the words you used.
do you want to?
Yeah.
There's definitions here.
Yeah. There are, at the moment, I think that is a bit of an issue, and is what we need to do in the next phase, really, is to look at the standard. Because I think back in 2009, that 5.1 billion that everybody talks about was what was called a minimum standard. So it was the minimum decent home standard, which is basically if one element fails, you replace it, or you replace part of an element. So it is quite a basic standard. The housing executive has obviously been repairing and improving the properties to a certain standard, but there's no real clarity on what that standard should be. So you're right, there needs to be some work around, okay, what do you want in terms of the standard going forward? What's the aspirations of tenants? But what are the aspirations for the housing executive to maintain those properties at a good quality? Because as I say,
not only the housing executives, like that would be an issue.
I think certainly one of the things that came across from the analysis that was carried out, I think it is about requirements and aspirations, and both of them needed to be added together. So the analysis showed a financial requirement which fluctuates depending on what the aspiration is for the standard of home. But what it does show is one of the issues that this project has to address is that in the future landlord delivery, whether that be as one single entity, two public corporations or another entity, we have to show how those aspirations and those requirements can be met and what the implications of doing that are. And that's really what this has concluded. The analysis here is saying this is the challenge. We are where we are. There's a variety of issues that have led to that challenge. And I have to say as well, it's fair to say that it's not unique at all. You know, the challenge that we find ourselves in terms of the maintenance of public sector homes is not unique, either in this jurisdiction or in other jurisdictions. And indeed, you know, it's a very real challenge, and the paper draws out that's emerging in public housing in the Republic of Ireland now are having to deal with similar challenges.
And I think it's looking at it long term rather than kind of annual budgeting and what can we spend each year. It's looking at it over a longer period of time.
Chairman, whether it's unique or not, I think we're in a fairly dire situation. And I would suggest that, I mean, the committee have lost focus in terms of some of the work we've been doing because of other things this last wee while. I really believe there should be a review in terms of how the housing side, in terms of this maintenance, have got into the state they're in. And I think the committee should be supporting a report done in terms of a review to find out how we're getting to a state where we're sitting at £6.1 billion to bring the house up to a minimal standard, I would suggest, as opposed to a good standard.
You don't need to come back on it. You know, you don't need to come back on it. It's because it's somebody's opinion. And
But that's been presented here, Chairman. A number of years ago, Savile, I think, criticised the housing executive because they said that they over-maintained their houses and they set it, I think there was changes set about then that lowered the standards. I think they were doing it a Decent Home Standards Plus, and it was lowered. So that has had a thing. Also, there's £240 million a year lifted in rent. You take that over 30 years, that's over £7 billion coming in also.
It's the gap, I think, as well. Just to draw a point out, it's 6.8 billion investment minus...
That's not
minus
mentioned,
Jim. Andrew Droid, the 734 is the gap.
Yeah.
That's the gap.
For 30 years.
look, not everybody having their say and everybody's having their opportunity to ask a question, and then you can get all the time in the world to come back on it again. You have enough for a minute, Trevor? Thank you. We have Dolores, then Michael, then Jim, then Gregory, and then Nicky.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Chair, just on some of the questions that go around my head in relation to the housing stock and its ownership, given the huge investment of public money, even through the housing associations, ultimately, if you do go down a particular route where most of the housing, if not all, is delivered through housing associations, and that housing association subsequently fails, how then is the money retrieved into the public purse, and what warranties are there for the public?
So all social housing stock that receives housing association grant, those properties, the grant is maintained as a charge against those properties. We would always work with housing associations to make sure they remain viable. For example, the department approval is required for any mortgages taken out against those properties. If a property is sold, the housing association grant is returned to the department, similar to any other capital receipt, and reused. If ultimately a housing association failed, which hasn't happened, in fact, hasn't happened in the UK either, but if it did fail, the regulatory provisions allow for the department to take that stock and assign it to another association. So it's fairly well regulated and protected.
Good clawback clause.
Yes,
isn't it?
yes.
Well, they may not
Absolutely.
have, sorry, just to add to that, I don't want you to think that we're not disclosing, but there have been problems with some major housing associations in Britain. So
There was one.
10 million?
I think there's been one quite recently, which was Cosmopolitan Housing, and that was partly to do with some student loans and student accommodation they took on. But because they're regulated and annually they have to submit viability returns and business plans to the regulator, in that case it was the Homes and Communities Agency, they kind of picked it up quite early. So before it got into any real difficulty, there was a merger with another association, so another association came in to take it on. And generally that's the role of the board, as well as funders, to make sure that you kind of get in there before there's a real difficulty.
But certainly we would do on sales, for example, if a home is sold, because housing association houses are sold to tenants as well, the capital receipt, the element that says grant, is recycled back into the system for new build.
And do you get an uplift to that in terms of inflationary value, or is it just the cash at the time?
It's the grant recycled into new build.
it's an interesting point, Dolores, if you don't mind me saying, but that just example shows how important it is to realise that all of these issues are interlinked.
Yeah.
You know, we had the regulator involved in that. We had, if you like, a function for the regional health authority, a regional housing authority, as well. So, and that's why this is quite complex in terms of making sure that the organisations will have the right powers available to them to intervene when it's necessary.
Well, Chair, I've been no surprise that I would share your scepticism, I would say, in relation to the drive that's behind some of these proposals, and the failure over the last 2 years in particular to actually spend the money either on plant maintenance or indeed a new build, and the implication that has had for the figures that have been presented to the committee today.
What a spend. Wonderful, Doris, well done.
Okay, that's,
You got a problem, Trevor?
okay, let's
Or
move
are you
on to
the
the next.
problem?
Sorry, folks, let's stick to the business in front of us. Okay, so, Dolores, you finished?
Mark yourself in the
Well,
spot.
Chair,
Mark yourself in the
Sorry,
spot.
let members, sorry, Trevor, everybody, please, let's try and get through the business. It's a very substantive presentation we have in front of us. People are trying to absorb the documentation as they're sitting here. Everybody has the opportunity to raise their question and get an answer and raise another question if they so desire. That's our job to do, so please
just
try to
one
keep it
final
on a
point, Chair.
professional basis.
the final point was in relation to the model looking around to local authorities. We all know, for example, that local authorities can own vast amounts of land that could be suitable for social housing. And I just wonder, in terms of your thinking through on these proposals, have you set aside or looked at an alternative, even if it didn't go down the route of delegating authority down to local councils in terms of social housing, whereby the local authority could enter into a partnership with the housing executive in terms of becoming a provider of social housing? Is that an option that you might consider?
Sorry, local authority, social housing providers.
Yes, but not as the authority.
This would be absolutely clear. We have not looked at local government in Northern Ireland being
A housing
a
authority.
housing authority.
So what are your
That was
proposals
considered as
then?
part of
Just
the review of public administration.
Sorry?
so you have a point within your document about local authorities. Could you just clarify that
Sorry,
then?
but there's, that said, that there wouldn't be the land, it's absolutely important that there are proper engagement arrangements in place with local government. Because, if a tenant has a problem, she'll phone the landlord, he or she will phone the landlord, either the executive or the housing association. If she doesn't get he or she doesn't get satisfaction, they will normally go to the local representative. And you will all have had lots of experience with tenants bringing issues with you. So at that level, we need proper arrangements, and for the landlords, whoever they are in the future, to be responsive to that. Then there's I think generally, local councils will be, and local council representatives will be interested in forward plans and all the rest of it, and we would like to see much better engagement, particularly with the housing association movement and local government. We know that the arrangements in place with the executive are very good. That's what people are telling us. But if there is probably a need to improve the arrangements with the housing association movement. And in any case, given the change in the with local government reforms, where local government has the planning responsibility, particularly, there will automatically be a reason for better engagement. Because if that engagement isn't in place, planning approvals may be more difficult to be achieved. And then there's the community planning function as well, Dolores.
But Andrew, if I could just ask the scenario whereby a local authority is a large landowner and there's a huge demand for social housing, but yet the auditor might demand that the land is sold at the market value. And I would just wonder, would you think of having discussions with the local government auditor in terms of allowing a flexibility where there's high demand for social housing and that the local authority could sell or transfer the land at a less than market value rate to meet the needs of its citizens?
Two things on that one. You'll be aware that we already have an arrangement in place where all surplus public land is circulated to public bodies, and for the purposes of this, even though they're not public bodies, housing associations are alerted to it. Housing associations, if the land's available and it's an area of high demand, will seek to conclude that sale with local government. Obviously, all parts of the public sector, and this is an issue, and I'm sure you've had briefings on the availability of land, have to achieve appropriate public value for that land. So there is a challenge about availability of land, or the sale of land at suboptimal value. I'm not sure it's something that DSD can deal with, but on the wider front, on land availability, you will see that leaving that specific issue aside, you'll see that in a potential future role for a regional body, we're saying that if one of the blocks to building new homes is land availability, could a regional body have a key role in land assembly and preparing the work and making more release? But the issue of less and best value, I'm not sure this is...
It depends how you define best value.
It is, but I think that's a matter.
The Housing Association grant offers a subsidy to the value.
Yes, but it'd still not be enough potentially in areas of high demand. Just
Well, I mean, obviously it'd be a thought for consideration, but there are two separate issues between local authorities having responsibility to provide housing as opposed to engagement in relation to housing, and that, I mean, I think it made it very clear. And to paragraph 132 onwards, that deals with local government engagement, and the functions are laid out in the reformed local government as well as the transfer of functions. So I think it's delineation is quite clearly there, and you again reinforce that, so thank you for that. Okay, there was Michael Copeland, and then
thanks, Chair. Thank you, Andrew, Jim, and Madeline. Andrew, at the beginning or partway through your presentation, you indicated that the receipts from the sale of public housing was reinvested in the current stock.
Michael, sorry, we can't hear you.
Sorry.
I need to be able to know when to check you. So.
That's a first, actually. People couldn't hear me. That the proceeds from the sale of public housing was actually reinvested. That wasn't my understanding as to what happened, and I would maybe like some further clarification on that. I would also be curious to know that essentially money is a very important factor in all of this. And as I understand it, the Housing Executive, which, like you've quite rightly said, is a landlord for 88,000 properties that employs somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 people, that gives a computation of employees per unit of somewhere between 20 and 30, which seems quite high. Now, given the fact that it is a landlord body and a policy, for want of a better word, body, I would have thought that one of the very first pieces of arithmetic you would need to do is to work out how much of the Housing Executive's costs are apportioned towards the landlord function. Because the 750 million shortfall over 30 years, which is still a large amount of money, may well be somewhat different if it turns out that the landlord function is currently subsidising the non-landlord function. At the same time, there also, I feel, is some requirement to examine the benefits that flow from it all being under one umbrella. I've always found housing executive staff, no matter what office I deal with, they all use the same systems, they all use the same operating procedures, and they're all pretty good, in my view, in my own experience, at what they do. So is there a natural progression, or is there an interchange within the housing executive umbrella of staff from the landlord function who are grounded in the recognition of apportionment and meeting of the need, and the strategic or more strategic functions? And would there be a danger that that natural progression from the grassroots, for want of a better word, upwards through the hierarchy, although not necessarily upwards, but through the hierarchy to the more strategic aims, is actually something worth looking at, worth considering? And how could that be ensured in anything other than the soft split, which could be done within the executive framework? And I would also be very curious to know if landlord function, I presume most housing associations restrict their activities to the provision of new social housing and the allocation and the maintenance of those properties. How much difference there is in the landlord function only between the number of properties within the remit of either the executive, which we know is about 88,000. The question is how many of the 3,000 odd employees are actually employed in the landlord function. And a coefficient figure that gives us some indication on a like-for-like basis the efficiency of the delivery of service.
Okay, I'll pick up some of those. Colleagues will have to help me.
On the land as well, where the land bank lies. And sorry, whether or not when public houses were sold, the establishment charge and associated debt that was with those remained with the housing executive, or did the proceeds from the sale cover the value? Because if it didn't, the housing executive was hamstrung to begin with, because it was attracting a proportion of debt on the basis of maybe 130 or 140 or 150,000 houses, whereas actually it was now spread over 90, so the per capita debt per unit must increase.
Okay. The recycling of the capital, I'll let Madeline and Jim deal with. The split of the cost is actually happening at the minute, work in progress, because the way the housing executive has been classified by the Office of National Statistics means that we have to actually separate in accounting terms the costs of the non-landlord function, and the landlord function then is accounted for as a quasi-public corporation, or will be accounted for. So that split and detailed split is ongoing.
And Andrew, did the 750 million deficit at the end assume that the landlord function and non-landlord function overhead remain within the same pool?
Do you want me to say? The 758 million is the landlord function only, and that's on the basis, as Andrew said, the kind of the accounting split that they've done so far.
So they have the figures?
They've done, but that's partly why we need to do more work on it, because there's been a split between landlord and regional, including an apportionment of the non-direct staff costs.
Establishment charges?
Yeah, so we need to look at that in a lot more detail.
Just
play about with the split.
I think just to add to the complexity, there's non-landlord.
Simple numbers too.
It is simple numbers, but this way it's a wee bit confusing.
Establishment charges,
Non-landlord.
you place the
There's
heading.
non-landlord functions and activities. Then there's landlord functions and activities. Then there's corporate services activities that cover both
Yeah.
in one organisation.
Yeah.
So it's also worth sort of saying that in terms of the income streams that the housing executive get, you've got your requirements to deliver, your delivery requirements, be they regional, be they maintenance, that's your costs and outgoings. You have your rent coming in, but you also get funding from the department.
Yes.
Grant funding. Primarily the grant funding is to deliver the regional functions for which there's no income generated because they're strategy functions. So
does the grant income equal the cost of service delivery?
For the regional, yes.
Totally?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also go some way to subsidising some of the landlord.
Yeah,
That's what it's about.
yeah, definitely. But the 758 is definitely just the landlord deficit.
And roughly speaking, just there's I think 3,300 employees in the housing executive. About 2/3 of them would be engaged in the landlord function, and 1/3 in the non-landlord regional activities.
So
But even
would
on-
the landlord function benefit from split in terms of the rental income and housing benefit income would be spread over a lower number of employees, so the cost per employee must be less?
No, it isn't. Because the regional bit gets grant funding
Yeah.
already.
Yeah.
In that.
But even on that split by the rental income, if you look at the management costs, they're around about, you kind of always do it cost per house or cost per unit, the landlord function, and they're around about £1,600 per year per unit. So that's the cost of maintaining the properties and also the cost of managing, so the staff costs as well as the indirect staff costs. That, on the face of it, when we compare it to other similar organisations, is quite low. So the average of, say, 170 local authorities in England of quite kind of substantial size, as well as some of the smaller ones, is about 2,000 or 2,100 per property.
Part of the housing association here.
The housing association numbers, we've got their figures. They have about 3,000 staff, but it's not like with like, because they also deliver an awful lot of support services. You know, they've been doing a lot of supported living, so they count their total staff numbers. There's a bit more work to be done to disaggregate the pure housing from the housing associations, supported dwellings.
Yeah.
And the income from the sale of properties?
So the income from sales, as far as I understand, is that the housing executive, based on previous years and the next year, anticipate the amount of sales that they will get, and there's a budget within the housing executive budget line for the landlord to recycle those receipts. So what we've assumed in the projections so far is that that carries on, but it sort of tails off eventually as you kind of, over time, over a 30-year period of time, you kind of run out of people who would be able to buy anyway. But I think on average at the moment, I think we've assumed around about 350 properties a year.
I will check, Michael, and the point here is I've said, that my understanding is that this resource was recycled and we were able to invest it. I need to check.
And I think it's probably part of both. My understanding is that there was a certain capital budget assumed within the housing executive, but assumed that would be funded from house sales.
Yeah.
If it wasn't met, then you got less, but if it was exceeded, it came in.
Then then it comes back into the department.
My understanding was it was a bit of both, if you know what I mean. They assumed the capital budget, say they assumed the capital budget of 80 million, but you sold 100 million, 20 million came in.
Yeah.
Okay, happy enough, Michael, for now. Okay, Jim? Gregory, and then...
The issue at this stage I wanted to get clear was the genesis of this reform package. Insofar as I would understand how government works, proposals for change can come from a number of sources. It can come from the department itself working up an issue because it's aware of problems and suggesting to the Minister you should bring forward some proposals in this. Or the Minister himself of his own volition, because it's an issue that he's particularly focused on, it may say to the department, I want to do such and such. Which of those, or maybe some other source, which of those lies at the source of this proposal?
The proposal for reform of the housing executive actually stretches back across a number of administrations, and a number of reports. And in the paper we detail that from the sector, from the housing sector, there are a number of reports generated.
I understand that, but what now has been the catalyst to bring it onto the table?
Well, I think the most recent iteration commenced in the previous executive when the Minister commissioned a review of the housing executive undertaken by PwC. That report was presented to the current Minister, so it spanned jurisdictions, and that current Minister then commissioned further work called a mature conversation, where it went out to test the recommendations that PwC were making with stakeholders. That report came back in, I think it was January 12. The Minister considered those recommendations and then put it forward to the executive that we take for further exploration and reform of the housing.
So just remind us how long has been the longevity of this particular process?
This process, I'm not even sure I know how long it was, because my commencement was May 2011. I had begun before that. I think the original PwC report commissioned, which flows out from my recollection, which I'll come back, I think was in November 2010. That report was commissioned and delivered in July 2011, with a further iteration in January 12, leading to an announcement to further explore these reforms. So it's been quite a long system and process of looking at how the structures might be improved.
Good. And looking to the end of the process, how long do you think that is?
So I could say that since this has been delivered with political consensus, it will be when this consensus and decisions are reached by the Assembly.
If I could give a personal insight into that, if you were asking me whether this process could potentially lead to a 100% transfer of public housing within 2 to 3 years, I would say Northern Ireland is not ready. That's my own position for that. We would hope, with your blessing, and once we have, got into more detail in the various components, be able to move ahead in a number of areas, such as rent policy, regulation and inspection, exploring the structure of the housing executive, and maybe some transfer, if that's deemed to be appropriate. That could be taken forward over maybe a 2 to 3 year period, but we're on a journey here, I would say, which is
pretty long journey.
Long journey.
And all those matters requiring executive approval.
Yes. Largely. Like, if any significant change in policy would require executive approval.
I suppose maybe it's worthwhile. I mean, Alan has quite a bit of experience of large-scale stock transfers, if that's happened, or reform of local housing structures, including management organisations, which are public corporations across the UK, and they're not quick.
No, I could use the Manchester example just because I used to work for Manchester City Council, and I think that it was probably 2002 that started, and it was kind of a mixed solution. So some retained in the public sector, some transferred, and that's probably taken at least 10, 12 years.
And that's without the delaying and blocking hurdles that we have in our governmental system. That's just...
There were probably some
sure
issues
these
in
issues
Labour
are
Group.
equally contentious in GB.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was particularly that easy in terms of political decision making, but it does take time. It takes time because you need to, if you're going to do a big change, you're required to consult, and you're required to consult tenants, and that all takes time, especially if you're going to do it in such a way that people start to understand the issues. It does just take time.
So from now, at least 10 to 12 years?
It depends on, I suppose it depends on the solution. So that example was a mixed solution. It was a significant number of transfers, a significant number of difficult transfers that were negative value. It was a creation of a new public sector organisation, landlord function. So it sort of depends on the complexity of the.
And in the Manchester case, did the eventual output in terms of cost savings or whatever, did they match up to the expectation?
I wouldn't be able to give you the exact figures, but the benefits far outweighed the costs of delivering.
So the benefits,
Financial and other.
and other, but in financial terms, did the Manchester experience deliver the savings that were promised?
It delivered the promises and the investment, yeah.
Including the financial savings?
Yeah. If financial savings were factored into individual transfers or new organisations, those savings were delivered as well.
Yeah,
Can I investment rather than saving?
Yeah, this issue is investment. We don't have the investment maybe for the individual cases. There's some figures in the papers there. The one that I remember
the 21
is in Wales. They've had private investment of 2.7 billion. You know, that's in addition to the public purse. Can you remember GB?
I think it's 21
billion,
21
I think it
billion.
is. The GB, the figures are in the papers. Now, in Northern Ireland, where we are now, is, again, if my memory serves me right, 180 million is what housing associations have brought to the table. And that's new money, that's additional to the public purse. And that's what's, you see, that's the other thing which maybe we haven't made enough of. You know, there's, if there is agreement here and there is a significant transfer, and then following that transfer, finance invested into the housing sector, that's an economic contribution as well into local communities. And then we've got this the Housing Plus agenda, where the housing associations who have been involved in these stock transfers have actually been working very, very close with the local communities, establishing social enterprises, offering, like a lot of them do their own maintenance and things like that, so they're offering opportunities for skills training. Now, we haven't painted any of that into this, but we know it's there, and it's something that in the final analysis we would want to...
And just finally, on the Manchester experience, it's interesting to have a case study, as it were. Has there been the extent of private interest and investment that was anticipated?
Yeah, every transaction got funded.
So there would have been a plan?
Yeah. So there would have been a business, so just think of one example. There would have been a business plan that set out the funding requirement to deliver the long-term investment in the homes, or it might have been kind of redevelopment, so demolition and new build, some kind of big regeneration schemes. And that new association or new landlord would have gone out to borrow from banks and would have got that required borrowing, and that sort of, it's part of the 21 billion, I suppose, as Andrew's mentioned, that's been new borrowing brought in to deliver the investment.
There's a number of case studies, but there's also quite extensive research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is available.
The other, sorry.
What I would suggest, Chairman, if you would agree, is that we could maybe just draw up a couple of the case studies and share them with the committee. Because I think that's a good idea. It actually then crystallises what potentially is possible.
I think it's probably, as well, it's difficult to understand what a large-scale stock transfer involves. I mean, it involves, if it was to be agreed, it would involve, in the case of GP, it involves the council saying, well, this is what we must have from this. And it involves a body responding saying, well, we will do all this and we'll deliver all this for tenants and we'll do it in X amount of time and we'll provide Y amount of funding. And unless that's provided, it doesn't happen unless tenants
and that's wrapped into a formal agreement as well.
The other, maybe just on the back of that, if the committee were interested in visiting some of these areas to see, talk to the local councillors, talk to the landlord, talk to the tenants, we would be happy to.
And I suppose as well, just for the committee's purposes, we would do, if that was interest, we would also do the other option, which is a council that's created like an ALMO, which is a public corporation but a separate landlord function.
Are there also examples of, say, because of the property crash and all that flowed from it, of failed ventures?
I haven't come across one.
I don't know of any.
The one that we mentioned was the Cosmopolitan.
Well, it wasn't.
That was Chester.
It was a big housing association. It wasn't actually. It wasn't on transfer.
Okay.
I said there are lots of reports available on this. It's been around for a long time.
Well, we can come back to that as you suggest, or Jim or Andrew at the second level, Gregory, and then Mickey.
Yeah, and it's very interesting analysis and presentation. I wanted to put a couple of questions to you on the issue of the rental position. Because, Andrew, you said a couple of times, and I presume I would, and certainly hopefully most people would agree with you in terms of the affordability of rents being crucial. And I see in the document sustainability of rents and then affordable rents again mentioned. It's just, it would have been known, I think, by most of us that, and understood, I think, by everyone, that there was this differential between housing association and housing executive. Until your document, I don't think the scale of the differential would have been known to as many people. Certainly not to, I was aware of the differential, as I say, most people were, but the scale of it, and not just the scale of the differential, but the stark contrast between us and England, Scotland and Wales in terms of that differential. And yet, you're saying there on page 29, the next step to take forward detailed work to develop and consult on a rent policy for social housing. And I notice in England, rent convergence was to be achieved by applying a differential to the increases local authorities and housing associations could apply. And similar things must have been done in Scotland and Wales, I assume, when you see the broadly similar rental increases. Which brings me to my question. If we have the position that 80% of tenants in our social housing sector are on housing benefit, and it may have been the case in the past, I'm not suggesting it was, but it may have been the case that rental increases may have been judged on the basis that 80% of people really aren't going to notice any difference anyway because of the housing benefit. But 20% would. How do you bring about convergence when A, the contrast is so stark, not just within Northern Ireland between housing executive rents and housing association, but the contrast throughout the rest of the UK is so distinct, and we have 20% of people to whom the convergence, assuming the convergence was downwards for them rather than upwards for the others, is so minuscule. The 20% is so few, and yet for the 80%, the difference would be marginal. Taking account of welfare reform out of the equation.
Yeah. And you're right. Yeah, it's that is a conundrum. You know, if this was all funded by housing benefit, you could move very quickly. But rents must be affordable, and they must be affordable to those 20% who, you know. So if there is a rent policy which emerges, it will be, I suspect, related to inflation in some way, and conversions, if that is the decision, would only be achieved over time, and by not raising the rents, you know, just slowly just bringing them together. Now, we've seen in England, I think it's 15 years they've taken. Now the gap is may not. I should qualify at figure 2 there, just underneath paragraph 97. The gap of £86.54, 73 and 86.11 is probably overstating, because it picks up the point that Jim was making earlier, that as we have looked at this, we have realised that that £86 includes the cost of services. So that when you get that, homes. You know, the figures will be significantly different, I suspect, but they will still, I suspect, still suggest that Northern Ireland is in the top quartile.
I also suspect there's an important factor as well that we haven't put in here, but you know, both the housing associations and the housing executive do continuous tenant surveys and ask questions such as, do you think your property is value for money? Do you think you're getting, and I think it's probably fair to say that we do have some work to do around those levels. It's in part driven by service charges, it's in part driven by there tend to be newer properties. But the satisfaction levels in terms of are you getting value for money are broadly comparable between the two sectors. And I think as well, you know, convergence, I mean, you also, if you read the detail paper and this paper, you'll find that while everyone has tried to do something, a lot of people have found doing things around rent very, very difficult to do. And actually the most successful one has been the English one in terms of convergence over a 15-year period. And it was controlled by allowing some people to increase slightly quicker than others. That was the way it was achieved.
It set a target, and the target was driven by local earnings as well as kind of bedroom size.
It's bedroom size, and also I think as well, it was driven by the fact that understanding a lot of these organisations, particularly those that were in the housing association sector, had entered into long-term funding arrangements, and they needed to have some certainty around their ability to meet those funding.
You had mentioned their satisfaction levels are quite high. But was there any distinction between satisfaction levels of the 80% whose rental was paid by housing benefit and the 20% who weren't?
I wouldn't be able to answer that figure, but certainly we can look into those satisfaction figures about whether it's, you know, someone who's paying the rent versus someone who's not having some form of intervention to assist with the payment.
Yeah. The other last question, Chairman, is obviously depending on the overall review outcome, but if we look at what we have at the moment, and housing associations continue to be the driver in terms of new build, you will quite quickly, I would have thought, I think I read somewhere that we could be up at around about 50 or 60,000 within 10 years. Housing association properties as opposed to the 36,000 at the moment, and presumably the housing executive gradually declining, because if there's no new building there is some lead off in terms of people purchasing. So you may within 10 or 15 years get to, roughly speaking, a 50-50 split or thereabouts.
Might do, yes.
And if there wasn't a change in the housing benefit entitlement, and there wasn't a drastic change in terms of the rent convergence, what would that do in terms of the future potential mix of housing?
So on the, just to, sorry, all these ones do get complicated. I mean, the increase in housing association is assuming new build, because the cheapest way to build a new home is only fund 50% of it and let the other half be borrowed. And that would say, if the aspiration that we have, the housing executive indicate that to meet housing need and unmet backlog, we should be building 2,000 homes per annum. So if you aspire to that over 10 years, that increases it by 20,000. I mean, the other element of it is the assumption of this, the outworkings of this 734 million gap, or 738, 58 million gap, is making certain assumptions about what the rent level will be in the housing executive. So it's made an assumption that it would be inflation plus 1, which it has been for the last 2-3 years, but then maybe it would only be inflation, which it had been for the number of years before that. So when you come to look at the gap, it's how much you have to invest, but how much you've got. We will have to do several scenarios, and I think that's quite right. We will have to do a scenario that sees rent go up by X and Y in the public sector. What would that mean? Go up by Z. So we haven't worked out those scenarios, but quite clearly the impact of rent impacts on the gaps and impacts on the requirements.
The point I was trying to drive at is it's relatively an academic argument. If 80% of the rent, whatever the rental level is coming from the public purse anyway, it doesn't really matter. But it does to the 20%.
It does for the 20%,
and that's the point.
Yes.
So I understand the issue about the gap and investment, but it is rather an academic argument when such a high proportion of the rents that are being paid are actually coming from the state anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is the purse that has to subvent the shortfall.
Yes, from the Treasury, yeah.
The people subsidy rather than
At
property.
this point in time, that is a free good to us.
Yeah.
You know, that's additional income. Now, you very quickly get into the welfare reform issues and all of that, and but
As we've discovered.
okay,
Just not this morning. Maggie?
Thanks for the presentation. I was going to ask about rent convergence, and Gregory has already dealt with that, but I think it's worth pointing out that of those 80%, quite a few of them would be working on low income, as we live in a low-wage society, so they're not all in benefit per se. They may be in working tax credits, that kind of thing, so I think that's worth pointing out. A couple of questions. If you look at the proposals that you've given us here today, they're all very much interlinked. So it's difficult to see how you could go forward without taking them as a whole, you know, and just taking bits out of them. That's one question. You say no decisions have been made, but if you talk to people in the housing executive, as I do on a regular basis, certainly at local office level, and I've always found them to be more than helpful and good at their job, I think the problem arises as you go up the chain. They would feel that it is a fait accompli. I think maybe that's something you need to address, because it's okay telling us they're the people at the coalface, and they have the difficulty accepting that the housing executive isn't going to go down the Swanee at some stage. So I think you need to address that. A couple of other questions. You talk about community development, employability and sustainability, and you've talked about, and I'd be interested in the role that tenants have to play, and indeed, because you're not just building houses, you're building communities. That's the way it should be. And you talked about we need a social housing model that is underpinned by fairness and equality. Obviously, we'd all agree with that. Ensures the provision of new social homes in line with need, but I think you would agree that it has to be objective need, and not just need. It has to be objective need, and that's been an ongoing difficulty, I think. So in terms of the going forward aspect, and the other thing about the housing associations, there has been a reduction in grants to the housing associations ongoing, as far as I'm aware, and is that going to be reduced, continue to be reduced? The other thing is, you talked about value for money, Jim, I think, and you do surveys in that. The Savile report in 2009 stated that we had some of the best social housing in Europe. Problem is it hasn't been maintained. And it was interesting when you go back to 2008, 2009, when the department had a policy of buying off the shelf. They then had to spend between 5,000 and 8,000 in bringing those houses up to decent home standards, because they weren't being built at that level. Developers weren't building them to that standard. And obviously that is an area that has to be looked at and addressed in terms of any future social housing, that there has to be a decent home standards. And I think it was accepted by the Savile report that the executive were very good at doing that. So those are just some of the questions I had.
I'll answer the first one, the last one first, sorry. In terms of the Housing Association grant, the the balancing act is to try and get as many houses we can get built with the money we have available, and that necessarily means that on a regular basis we review the grant levels to see can we cut the grant, deliver more homes and still maintain it viable. We have agreed with the Housing Association moving it for the remainder of the CSR. We're fixing levels at the current level. We do review individually what the total cost indicator is, but we've agreed to keep levels, and I think it's about 45% at the moment, or with abnormals it can be up to 50%. In terms of 2008-9, you're talking about off-the-shelf purchases. Really, at the height of the boom, or actually the height of the bust, I suppose, maybe it's the other way around, it was good value to buy off-the-shelf properties. It wasn't decent homes that they were being built to. It was the Housing Association guide for new homes, which was like a lot higher standard. So there have been some adjustments made in terms of lifetime homes and the width of doors and that sort of stuff. Increasingly that hasn't been the case now. Most homes are, the building control standards raised quite significantly to be very close to the standards we were requiring in terms of thermal efficiency, so there's less amounts. Also currently there's a lot more, because the market's picking up, there's much more rebuild versus off the shelves. There's not as many of them available. So that's the Housing Association grant bit and the payment. The issue around Savills and the current issue we've displayed is actually exactly as you said. There's good stock, but if you want to make sure that it stays good stock and address pockets of poor stock, because there are pockets of quite poor stock, particularly around some of the thermal efficiency stuff, there's a need for investment, and maybe strike it more. There's a need for investment that's more than about response maintenance and more than about kitchens and windows. It's about much more structural, and that's really what our work is showing.
Jim, just to add to the Housing Association grant, what some housing associations do elsewhere is because they're allowed to do for sale for development or kind of low-cost home ownership, they do that and then cross-subsidise the social rented, which you don't do a lot of that here. And because they're able to do that, you can reduce the HAG, which then you kind of get more new build for your HAG. So there's some options to look around as well.
Just one point in finishing, Chair. Ms Michael had raised the point about selling off houses and then using the money to build. In my recall, in the first year, late 70s, early 80s, I think there's 45 million taken in the sale of houses. But that didn't go to build houses, that went straight back to the British Treasury. And that seems to have been a feature going back for many years. So, you know, the point, it was sold. The scheme was sold as something that was going to be beneficial to actually improve and increase social housing here in the north. It didn't happen. And you know, when we talk about money being available and the cost, we have a department that is responsible for social housing, and back to date almost £70 million this year. Now somebody agrees planned maintenance and all, but you could build a fair number of social houses and supported housing with £70 million.
And I would, like yourselves, hope and trust that the experience of the past years and the anomaly doesn't happen again.
Thanks. Thank you for that. Trevor, are you looking back in again?
Yeah, just on page 28, in terms of that table, I was just slightly confused by. I can understand you're doing a calculation in terms of uplift from 2001 to 2011. I'm just curious in terms of Northern Ireland figures, the £54. What does that represent?
That's usually the average for a three-bedroom house. Per week.
I think.
Yeah.
It is.
So is there a difference between what they pay for a three-bedroom house and what the housing executive pay, or sorry, the housing benefit pay the housing executive?
No. At current, unless you're on partial housing benefit covers your social housing rent in full.
Yeah. It's just, if I look at the housing benefit,
or a housing executive home.
if you look at the housing benefit calculator, then the cheapest three-bed in Northern Ireland is £88.16. So I'm just curious where you put £54. If the housing benefit branch don't pay the housing executive more than what the rent should be, why in the current calculator is it suggesting that the three-bed rate, the cheapest is £88.16?
I'm not sure what the calculator is. I'm not sure the rate it's quoting. I'll have to look into that for you. Come back.
I mean, could we come back to that one? Can we also come back? I mean, I struggle with this one as well. Sorry, it's actually £88.15.
Is that private sector?
I think that's private sector.
Is that private sector?
Well, this is.
Rents.
So the housing benefit for the private sector is calculated by local housing allowance, and therefore the maximum you can get is what the local housing allowance rate is. So the maximum or 88. Housing benefit for a social home is whatever the rent is.
And it can be linked to the, I think it's the 30th percentile of the local housing allowance.
I need to,
For the social
it could be
rented,
two
yeah.
different. That could be housing benefit for private rented
rented,
sector,
yeah.
and these are the rents being charged in the social sector. And if you're on a housing benefit, it covers your full rent, irrespective of what it is.
You have enough Trevor to clarify that. You have enough Trevor to end the just I mean, you've raised it and the officials will come back with maybe some report on that. Fabian, on the final point.
Just to see in the calculation, you know, the housing associations, when they've been looked at in terms of housing benefit, are calculated on the same level as the private rented sector. So you have private housing benefit and you have social housing benefit within the sector. The going rate of people who are applying for it may be £88 a week. That they would be able to claim a housing benefit, and that's amalgamated over the month. And then, but housing sector, and when we talk about 80% of people on housing benefit, you know, if you have a dependent in the house, a dependent that's working in the house, that seriously skews the thing. So you could be getting 10p housing benefit or 20p housing benefit. So all that needs to be taken into. When you just say a figure, there's 80% of people on housing benefit. That's correct, but it may not all. Be a level playing field, or maybe people just getting 10p, 20p, or a pound of that.
I appreciate that for the Chair. It's actually not a level playing field anyway, because you've got about 6 different rates in Northern Ireland for housing benefit, which you shouldn't have either, because Northern Ireland's a fairly small region. And I mean, there's nowhere impossible to travel. When you're paying £106 as versus £88.
That would require probably maybe a discussion, because it is about the local housing allowance, and I mean, I think you're going to
crossing private and social.
The point that I was going to make was that we've spent a lot of time discussing 2 of the main providers of socially rented accommodation, which is Housing Association and Housing Executive, but we haven't touched on the biggest provider of socially rented accommodation, which is the private rented sector. And some of the accommodation that's provided there not only doesn't meet the decent home standard, but is a downright disgrace, and we're paying 140, 150 million pound a year housing benefit on it.
Okay, fair point.
I know there has been briefing on the regulation of the private rent sector and proposals within that, and we'll be shortly coming to committee on proposals for the minimum home standard, which is in the housing strategy, which will go some way to hopefully addressing some of those issues.
Okay, I think there's been a fair bit of discussion this morning, and rightly so. It's a very important issue. I mean, could I actually ask members to bounce and people? I mean, can we agree that we will be very keen to engage with the department in a structured way on the progress of this? And I mean, I think, in fairness to yourselves, you made it very clear that there are a range of options. I think you've taken on board a lot of the issues that people have raised with you before, and also again today. So, I mean, without in any more detail, we're agreed that we want to have a good engagement with yourself. We'll do it on a structured basis, and we can work that out between ourselves and then put that into the schedule. Is that fair enough? Okay, could I thank yourself, Andrew, Jim and Madeleine, for your presentation this morning, your efforts to respond to questions.
It seems that we're being offered a fait accompli because of what's going on with the housing executive. Should that not cease?
You put the point, and we're going to have the housing executive officials here specifically and directly to answer that. So I think the points have been made from on the record. Maybe so. Okay, members, so thank you yourself for that, and we'll move on to the next item, which is post-subordinate legislation. I'll do that. Okay, members, so we're on the proposed subordinate legislation. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 items under subordinate legislation. Can I take it that members have actually read these? We have the SL1 on Social Security Maternity Allowance, one on Mortgage Interest Direct Scheme, Westminster Financial Assistance Scheme regulations, and then the 3 SL1s and one statutory rule. So can we take the 3 SL1s for all our members content to that the rules be made, the SL1, 3 SL1s. Members content with that? Take that as agreement. Then in terms of the SR 33, with Social Security crediting and treatment of contributions, national insurance numbers, amendment, regulations, Northern Ireland 2014. Members, content that this rule be made. The committee first considered the rule on the 30th of January, and we've had a discussion around it. If members contend, then I'll read the motion into the record. Members content? Okay, so therefore, just for the record, that the Committee for Social Development has considered statutory rule SR 33/2014, the Social Security crediting and treatment of contributions and national insurance numbers, amendment, regulations, Northern Ireland 2014, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objection to the rule. All agreed? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much, members. Moving on to then the correspondence, just a number of items draw to your attention. On page 114 of your pack, the WFM Committee has written to the committee seeking views on the terms of reference. It is drawn up for its inquiry into the Barroso Task Force. I mean, I'm just asking if people want to comment on this. It's happy enough to put a nil response in if that's what people want. I mean, all the parties are represented on the OFM, so unless I'm getting any suggestions or proposals for an actual response, then we'll just put in a nil response in. Members happy enough?
Right.
Okay, so could I then just ask members then, you content with the correspondence in the memo? And further to that, then the Minister has written regarding the reforms of the Child Maintenance Service, and the Minister has advised, as you can see there, it's on page 137, that the Minister has been advised of a go-live date for 30th of June for phase 2 of the reforms, and the Minister has agreed to adhere to that same timeline. Members happy enough with that, or want any comment to make? If not, we're happy enough to note that then. Thank you for that. Page 104, I think, as well as, let me see this, 104, as well as 139 of the tabled items. Yeah, so we'll read 104 in your pack, and then 139 in your tabled items. Department has responded to the committee's concern about the landlord registration scheme, and that includes response on the concerns about the search facilities in the database. So are members content to note that correspondence? And then the remainder of the correspondence the memo provided. Members agree, we'll move on then. Moving on to the forward work programme, again you'll have in page 164 of your pack, you have the programme there, but again, just remind ourselves that we did agree that following the presentation we had this morning, that would likely flow from that. Then there would be obviously a whole maybe series of discussions around housing, and we've agreed that housing would be one of the more strategic issues of concern and attention from the committee in the forward work programme. What I was going to suggest is, because we do need to have probably a round-robin discussion around the programme of work, and I was going to suggest, well, Kevin's suggesting actually that we give ourselves what we call an away day on the 27th of March. We're recommending here, like a meeting out of the room, just so as we are out of the building, so as we can just thrash out the substantive programme for work. We'll have in front of us. The members content, then we make a necessary arrangement. It's the 27th of March we're recommending. And obviously that will take on board the fact we've already agreed here this morning that we do want to engage with the department. We're very keen to do so in terms of social housing reform programme, but there are a range of other issues in respect of housing, some which were addressed this morning, including concerns raised by members yourself and other members on an ongoing basis. But there are a range of other strategic interests of concern. This committee, Trevor, you referred to this earlier on, things that the committee has a need to put more substantive attention to, whether it's town centre, reach entries, neighbourhood renewal, alcohol, gaming legislation, and a whole raft of issues that the committee rightly has an interest in. So our members content then that we'll schedule away day, and we'll put all of this to the committee at that point.
Chairman, yeah, just a separate issue. I noticed with some correspondence on landlord registration, and it had been raised a couple of times since the presentation. I just wonder maybe for next week, if it's just I've had a number of representations since the presentation here, and because, as I alluded to, I was present at a presentation in my constituency on the issue of landlord registration. And I just wonder if we could get from the department what way, over the course of the next few weeks and months, they are going to further make people aware of the need of the registration. to avoid some of the problems that a number of us highlighted at the time of the presentation.
Okay, I'm more than happy to get that done.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for that. Drawing that to our attention. Okay, so then just moving on then to the next item, which is any other business. Anybody anything to raise under AOB? Sorry. Yes, we did. We were referred to the press release which we were going to issue in respect of the department extending the time frame for the consultation on antisocial behaviour, and we had a press release draft there for members. The intention was to release that if the department had agreed to extend the consultation period. It wasn't released because we hadn't been advised that there was an extension for the period. We discovered that almost by accident, but that thankfully then that extension has been given. So on that basis then we want to issue that press release. The members happy enough then? Great. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, members. So nothing to raise under AOB then. On that basis then the meeting stands adjourned to next Thursday, 6th of March at 10 a.m.
Is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 29.